I'm here with Reginald Sewell at the firm. He's a corporate securities attorney. It handles a bunch of different matters in a number of industries, but one in particular that we're excited to share with you is about accounting firms. And it's been a kind of a hot industry the last year or two, and I wanted to bring him here to share some of his experiences about what's going on now. Not just on the legal front. This is kind of going to be like, from our perspective as attorneys, what we're seeing and what the industry is doing. So thanks, Reggie. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Chris. I am happy to provide any advice regarding this specifically hot trend in 2025 M&A space.
So let's talk about what a roll-up is. So we see people doing this in a number of different industries, but let's talk about it in accounting specifically. Just what does that mean when a company's doing a roll-up in the accounting space?
So basically what accounting firms are doing now, the trend in 2025 is to either go through acquisition opportunities or basic diversification of their services. So with regard to acquisition, we're seeing a lot of accounting firms acquire other accounting firms for succession management. Older firms are looking to pass on their clients, and they need an opportunity to do that. Hence the acquisition strategy for CPA firms. Now, also CPA firms are looking to vertically integrate their models with their vendors, specifically bookkeeping companies, payroll companies, specific tax companies that specialize in offshore tax work. So we're seeing consolidation, vertical consolidation within the industry, CPA firms and their vendors. And finally, this is, the third opportunity that CPA firms are taking advantage of is leveraging their client base to provide high-end financial services via the acquisition of home offices, which home offices are essentially financial management organizations that are regulated by the SEC, of course, for high net worth individuals. It makes sense, okay? Instead of referring CPA firms, referring their clients over to home offices, why not just go ahead and acquire one? So you can not only provide accounting work, but you also can provide financial service work, which is where the real value is at.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot there. That was awesome, and I'm just going to unpack it a little bit at a time. So one thing is, you mentioned they're vertically integrating with some vendors, things like that, or other companies. You mentioned bookkeeping. So why would an accounting firm want to offer bookkeeping services to its clients? What's the strategy there?
It's simple integration. Accounting firms already use bookkeeping firms. I guess a lot of you are probably familiar with Gusto. Now with Gusto, it's completely online bookkeeping work. They do billing, they do bookkeeping, they do payroll. But what we found, and a lot of the feedback I'm getting from accounting firms, is that when they're outsourcing their bookkeeping or outsourcing their payroll, is getting way too expensive. We're seeing, right, in 2025, an increase in about 15 to 20% of their fees. So again, this is another opportunity for them to integrate vertically by acquiring vendors. That is the strategy behind acquiring, bookkeeping and payroll services.
Right. And then this is not something you mentioned earlier, but I just think it's fascinating. One of my clients mentioned to me about a year or two ago, and I've kind of heard it in other places too, that there's not enough accountants, like young accountants, that they're all retiring and that they're not going to have
Sure.
enough to. I mean, yeah, tell us about that.
Yeah, that's they're seeing a lot of turnover in the industry. Now, I think we should make a distinction between the lack of accountants that work for small to mid-sized accounting firms. Now with the large E&Y, okay, they have no problem finding accountants, right? But it's the smaller mom and pop, mid-sized regional accounting firms that are having problem, finding talent.
Yeah. So it seems like, and based on what you said, it brings me back to business school, and it's one of the tried and true strategies for adding value, which is taking an industry that's kind of fractionalized and then consolidating it in a sense by maybe acquiring a bunch of small accounting firms in different geographic markets, consolidating that together, pooling resources, shared services. Is that kind of one of the strategies too?
Yeah, it's either the basic M&A or let's not say M&A. The basic growth strategy. There are two ways to grow. You can either do it organically, you can build it, or you can buy it.
Right.
And so what they're seeing, it just makes more financial sense, makes more economic sense at this point to acquire these targets. It makes more sense to acquire it than build it, because most of the time they're already outsourcing these services.
Right.
Okay, they're already outsourcing it. So instead of me, spending my capital on growing it internally or paying somebody, expensing it out, it just makes more sense for me to go ahead and acquire it.
Right, that makes sense. And I'm going to start asking about some of the legal ways to structure this and how you're doing it with clients. But I'm just curious because I read something recently, maybe a week or two ago. One of my friends sent me an article, and it was about accounting firms. I think it was one of the big four, going to Arizona or wherever these ABSs are, alternative-based legal services, and they're opening up their own law firm. So are you seeing any of that with clients too, or talking about it?
Yeah, it's a little, that structure, it's a little more complicated than what my clients are necessarily looking for. Okay, they're not necessarily looking to move into the legal space or form a relationship with attorneys.
Which is a lot harder than done. Easier said than done.
Right. No, they're focused on consolidating within their industry and taking advantage of the competitive advantages that they have in their industry at this point.
So let's talk about deal structure. So you got this client, they want to do some acquisitions, you're working with them, maybe you're going to work with them on the LOI and some of their basic documents, try to really streamline the process. How are you valuing deals, purchase price? How are you structuring the payment of the purchase price? You're going to do, I guess, asset purchases. Are you going to have non-competes for the sellers where they have to stay for a certain period of time? Are they going to receive any interest in a holding company for maybe some later exit, some potential growth, and you have retention of the accountants? What are client, and I'm sure there's different approaches, but kind of what are you seeing out there?
Well, most of the deals that we're seeing, they're not asset purchases.
Okay.
They're equity plays, formally acquiring, the target via traditionally or through some sort of reverse merger. It's the structure itself is not where we try to focus on.
Okay.
What we're focused on are key issues that come up regarding the regulatory process when it comes to acquiring an accounting firm, a payroll firm, or a home office. There are certain regulatory issues that come into play, specifically with, we'll take for instance with accounting firms.
Okay.
There's certain rules out there that govern who can own an accounting firm.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Now.
Depending on the state.
Depending on the state, depending upon what services they provide. Okay. So, are they just providing basic accounting services, or are they providing auditing services?
Mm-hmm.
So now, if they're providing both, it depends upon the rules in the state who can actually own the accounting firm. So that affects the whole thought process and structuring the transaction. That those are the type of things that we have to address first before we can say, okay, this is how we should do the deal.
That totally makes sense.
And then let's take, for instance, when you're looking to acquire, a home office, and that's already listed with the SEC as an RIA. That's an animal in itself. Okay, if you're an RIA, which most of these guys are, most of these home offices are, you're licensed.
What's an RA?
Registered Investment Advisor.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
That's under the SEC 40 Act. Okay, you're governed by the SEC. You're audited by the SEC. So acquiring an RIA, which accounting firms want to do, because that's where that high value fees are going to come from. The high value financing work is going to come from, and they can leverage their current client base. But doing that deal it may need regulatory authority approval, may need regulatory consents. It's definitely probably going to need client consent from the RIA client consents. There's a lot of legal due diligence that Johnsen Law has the resources to provide its clients.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned due diligence. It oftentimes gets glossed over. So that was really important with the regulatory due diligence. And then, I'm sure the reps and warranties are pretty important, making sure that everything's compliant. That has to be heavily negotiated in the transaction, I'm assuming, right? Yeah, of course, standard M&A work, reps and warranties, consents, regulatory work. And then what we found, it's the financing part of it can get tricky, also. And Let's talk about that.
This actually goes back to what we were just discussing on the regulatory side. So, what we've seen is that whether or not you're a buyer or a seller in the market, if you have taken or borrowed money from a bank that guaranteed that the loan was guaranteed by the federal government, or you borrowed money directly from the federal government, the SBA or EIDL loan, it gets tricky. Okay. Now, some of these guys want to go back to the SBA and say, okay, I want to finance the deal through the SBA again. Okay. And whether or not they can do it, it depends if they went through the SBA EIDL process correctly when they first did it, and how they use those funds and how much money they still owe the SBA. So if you're on the buyer side and you're looking, no. If you're on the seller side, what I was talking about was the buyer side. If you're on the seller side, it can also get tricky that there may be certain covenants in your agreements that prevent you from selling all your assets, because those assets are basically collateral for the loans. Right. So there again, you have to go through the consent process. You have to go through the due diligence, and you don't want to wait till the 11th hour to figure all this stuff out when you're trying to close a deal, and they're like, no. And what we found is that it's very difficult to negotiate with the federal government. That may change, but currently it's very difficult to negotiate with the federal government to get them to change their mind on whether or not to approve, either from the seller side to approve the transaction, or from the buyer side to approve additional funds to finance the deal. Okay, we've talked a lot about the buy side, which is natural because we're talking about
potential roll-up or multiple acquisitions, which would be kind of a good client for us that we would work with. But we also represent sellers, kind of a little more like one-off deals. So if someone's an accountant or maybe an ancillary profession like bookkeeper, what should they start thinking about if they're interested in one day selling their business?
Corporate governance, that's number one. You always have to start with corporate governance because, like we've discussed, Johnsen Law, we're very good at our due diligence, and that's the first thing we're going to do. We're going to go through your books, go through all your due diligence, go through all your corporate governance, make sure all the documents in place, figure out who owns what. That's you'll be surprised at how many sellers really do not know who owns what.
Right.
Is there debt out there? Putting together an accurate cap table, pulling together all your documents. If you borrow money from lenders, this goes back to the covenant issue on whether or not you can either do the deal or do you have to get a consent from a third party. It's just basically getting your house in order before reaching out. As part of reaching out to us, because we're experts at this and we can help you through the process. That's what we're here. And the earlier the seller gets on with us, and this is for the buyer side too, the earlier you engage us, the smoother the transaction will go. Do not, what we recommend is that you hire a law firm like us. Do not try to use a broker as your counsel, because the broker is incentivized differently than the way we're compensated. Okay, they're only incentivized to close a transaction even if it's not done correctly. I'm not saying all brokers are like that, but you know, we tend to see that with some brokers. But engaging us early is the best thing that you can do to answer your question.
And I love our broker friends, and they send deals occasionally, but I agree. When I enter into that attorney-client relationship with one of the parties, one of the first things I tell them when there's a broker around too is, look, I am your 100% best friend on this transaction.
Correct.
You can trust me with anything. I've got your back. I'm bound by privilege, all this kind of stuff. Like, I am here for you 100%. And the brokers are there for their clients, but they're there for the transaction. They want the transaction to close. I believe ultimately that's their client. And, you know, trust your brokers. I absolutely believe it. I don't want to get in the way with that. But it's just a dynamic. It's kind of knowing the players. And once the attorneys get involved, and look, the criticism of us is that we're, you know, deal killers. Well, that perception, I think, comes from the fact that maybe some of us, you know, are pushing for an issue that is super important that the parties don't truly understand. Or maybe the attorney is overdoing it and killing the deal. Who knows? And I'm sure you've seen that everywhere along.
Yeah, it's fundamentally, we have a higher fiduciary responsibility. We are officers of the court, okay? And we have an ethical responsibility to you. We have an attorney-client privilege responsibility to you. If there is a conflict in place, we have to disclose that conflict to you. So everything that we do, and again, this is the reason that you should engage a firm like our firm, Johnsen Law, as soon and as early as possible, so we can get out in front of anything that may potentially hold up the transaction.
Okay. I think this is one of my last questions, and I'm going to talk about money again because it's really the most what a lot of sellers focus on. Are we seeing all kind of third-party finance or cash deals? Are we seeing maybe a percentage of revenue over time? Are we seeing like earnouts? Is there any seller financing that's being requested? You got all these social media people are like, seller finance everything, you know? And so all these buyers are wanting to do that. What are we seeing the parties come together on Or is it just kind of like all over the place?
It's whatever they come to an agreement.
Okay.
Like, we've seen seller finance deals, we've seen third party, we've seen private equity, we've seen SBA. It's whatever the parties come to agreement on. Now, take for instance, with regard to acquiring certain vendors, okay, whether it's bookkeepers or payroll, most of these guys and gals are completely remote, completely online.
Right.
There's no brick and mortar.
Right.
And that's why it's so easy to get these deals done if you get in front of it. But it still takes time to really understand the seller's business. So I think you mentioned this when we first started. The seller will, in certain cases, enter into some sort of consulting agreement to stay on for 2 to 3 months to help transition the business and to make sure and to give confidence to his staff, his or her staff, right? So we have seen that. We're starting to see a lot of that actually, and then we're also seeing with the seller financing piece, it's usually a note.
Yeah.
Okay. It's because the deal is an equity deal, and for you to for the seller to retain a piece of the company, it gets complicated for tax purposes.
Right.
So it's usually a note that's paid out over time. Now it can be. We can make it as complicated as it needs to be from the buyer side. If it is seller finance and there's a note in place, we can add an earnout as a condition to not necessarily the purchase price, but paying not necessarily the third party purchase price of the transaction, but the sellers. The seller finance part, we throw an earnout on that, so that will not only incentivize the seller to cooperate with the transition, but to provide accurate information regarding the actual revenue in their client base.
Right. So we talked a lot about seller revenue or seller financing. What's a drawback of seller financing? What is a reason that maybe a seller wouldn't want to do it?
Because their compensation for the business is still tied to the business, and technically they're no longer operating in the business.
Right.
They have no control over the business. Even with these consulting agreements, they only last 2 to 3 months.
Right.
And the earnout can last for 12 to 18 months or 24 months.
Right.
And they really have no control.
Okay.
So the risk with the seller finance and coupled with an earnout, their risk is very high.
Right.
You don't see a lot of seller attorneys like seller finance deals because it's way too risky. And here's the other reason: we're in professional services, all right? If we were selling widgets, there would be collateral.
Right.
We're in professional services, so that's another risk.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the clients could, decide after 6 months, well, I don't like, I don't like the way the buyer is handling things, the new owners are handling things. I'm going to take my business elsewhere.
Right.
Okay. So that's another risk that makes seller financing risky, difficult for sellers.
Right. Yeah, I always tell people, just to kind of explain it super simply, is typically if you're the seller, you want as much money now up front.
Right.
And the buyer would want to defer a lot of that as much as possible. That's just kind of the tension that goes on.
Yeah, to make sure that they're, the reps and warranties are accurate, and that they're actually acquiring what the seller is saying that they're going to sell.
Well, look, this was super interesting. I love this space, love working on accounting transactions with accounting firms. Reginald does a bunch of this, lots of experience doing corporate M&A and securities as well. Reginald, thanks for talking today.
Great, Chris. Thank you.
I'd like to take a moment and thank you for watching. Please like, share with a friend, save for later, or subscribe to this channel to get more videos to help your business build, grow, and succeed. And of course, you can always head over to johnsenlaw.com. That's JOHNSEN law.com for more free resources.